Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm the host, Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And today, my guest is Chris Wright, the chairman and CEO of Liberty Oilfield Services. Chris, thanks for being with us today.
Thrilled to be here with you, Robert.
Great. So I want to talk about several things. You've been in the hydraulic fracturing business for more than 20 years now. Close to 30 years. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about Liberty, and you just did a major deal with Schlumberger. But before we do that, I don't like long introductions. I don't like to introduce other people. I like them to do it themselves. So if you don't mind, I'm putting you on the spot here. Imagine you just arrived at a dinner party. You don't know anyone there, and you're going around the table, and it comes to you. Hi, why are you here? What's your name?
I'm Chris Wright, and my short bio is I started out as a science geek. I transitioned to a tech nerd, and then I've been an energy entrepreneur my whole life. To me, I realized at a young age that energy enables everything else: climbing mountains, traveling the world, lifting people out of poverty, all the things I cared about. So I've spent my life trying to figure out how we can assure a better energy future for the world. Wrong about a lot of things, but that's been my odyssey.
Wrong, but never in doubt. Maybe.
Yes.
Well, that's a good introduction. I like that. So now tell me, you're the chairman and CEO of Liberty. You just did a major transaction with Schlumberger and took on some of their assets. Tell me about Liberty and your company, because I imagine a lot of people that listen to this podcast won't know about Liberty.
Yeah. Well, Liberty first, the name is, I've been a passionate bottom-up organization guy, free people, free organization, bottom-up, not top-down. So hence the name Liberty. And Liberty Oilfield Services is a frac company. We work from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, all in the U.S. We've been a tech company from the start, so founded by what we say highly competitive tech nerds. And we've just looked at how do we make frac better, more efficient, more oil and gas, smaller impacts on the broader environment and local communities, and a different culture in the company. So low turnover, and the models work very well. We started it 9.5 years ago, and it's grown pretty rapidly. And yeah, as you said, Robert, we just did a transaction. We took over Schlumberger's frac business, so the largest oilfield service company in the world, and frac was also one of their biggest business lines. But they want to focus more on things they have a great competitive advantage at. And I think they recognize Liberty was the best player in frac, and we're very technology embracing as they are. So we're going to combine their people, their technology, and their equipment with our people, our technology and equipment, and make it into a better, stronger Liberty. Big challenge ahead, though. Big challenge for us.
So I want to come back to the Schlumberger deal in a little bit, but let's start from the basics, because there's been a lot of controversy, a lot of talk around hydraulic fracturing, and a lot of people claiming it's dangerous and causes all kinds of groundwater problems. What is a frac spread? How does this process work? Just a quick preliminary: you come in, another company comes in with a drill rig and drills the wellbore, and then you come in, right? And what do you do?
Exactly. So you drill 2 miles down, make a right or left turn, drill 2 miles along in shale. And shale is this very impermeable rock. It seems like it should be a kitchen countertop or the slate in your patio, not a rock you could easily move something through. So we pump water with some chemicals at very high pressure out holes that are shot in that pipe to create a lot of plumbing to connect this very impermeable rock back to the wellbore. I always say, if you could miniaturize yourself, Robert, and go into a frac, if you looked at a square foot of the rock that's accessed by this frac now, about a tablespoon of oil will come out every few days. So you wouldn't even see the oil moving out of the rock. It comes out so slowly. So the idea of frac is to put a whole bunch of underground plumbing created by pumping water that cracks this rock, and then a little bit of sand goes in there too, to just hold this little gap open that allows oil to seep out of that shale and flow into the wellbore. So the equipment we show up on location, it's about 50,000 horsepower. That's basically the power of a 747 jet engine. So it's spread over a number of trucks, some mixing equipment to add the chemicals and sand together, 15 to 18 human beings on location. The control thing looks like mission control in Houston. There's a large truck with a whole bunch of computers and cameras and technology that control these pumps, this mixing equipment, to safely pump at very high pressure fluid underground at a high rate.
And so 40 to 50,000 horsepower. So why do you need that? I've been on a frac spread. I've seen it myself. Why so much muscle? Why do you need that much power to drive this process?
And the reason is the biggest use of that power is that as you go down, you go 2 miles underground. If you go 2 miles under the sea, the pressure is about 4,000 PSI because the weight of water. You go 2 miles under rock, rock's about 2.5 times heavier than water, although fracs open at a different angle, but maybe it's 8,000 PSI. So you've got to get all the way up to 8,000 PSI before you can even move the rock apart. So you've got to get at that high pressure that'll separate the rock, and then you've got to transport this fluid down at the start of 4 miles of pipe, 2 miles vertical, 2 miles horizontal, and you want to pump at a pretty good rate. We'll typically pump, at 2, 3, 4,000 gallons a minute at very high pressure. So that takes a lot of power.
And that high pressure. So what pressure? What are the pressure gradients then in the frac zone where you're actually injecting the water and the sand? What are the pounds per square inch in those locations?
Yeah, so the downhole pressure in the frac itself, could be anywhere from 7,000 PSI to 15, 18,000 pounds per square minutes. So just that pressure right there, it's like being miles underneath the ocean. So just to move something takes a lot of force, but then to move it fast and a lot of stuff means power. Frac fleets are power hungry.
Right.
We need to put a lot of energy to move the rocks and get the stuff out there.
And you're constantly, from everything I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, you're constantly changing the mix, right? The amount of pounds of sand per gallon. You're constantly, there's not one recipe, right? You're constantly changing the recipe depending on the formation, the depth, the pressure, all those things. Is that there's not
exactly. That's what I say. There's like mission control there with engineers in a van that are controlling the equipment, that are watching what's going on. We have a satellite dish on top of all of the mission controls for each frac fleet that's sending that data to our customer's office, back to our Denver office. Yeah, one misunderstanding of the oil and gas industry is people think we're old and dirty and low tech. It's actually an incredible user of technology. My whole background is in technology. And the other thing, Robert, I'll make, if I can make that point,
sure.
The idea of hydraulic fracturing, we're actually stealing it from Mother Nature. All the oil and gas production that we get elsewise, it all comes from hydraulic fracturing. When small single cellular organisms lived in the ocean 100 million years ago, 500 million years ago, they die, they fall to the bottom of the ocean, and they get buried. And it's only if they get buried in impermeable rocks that they actually don't break down normally by mixing with oxygen. They get sealed and encased and ultimately cooked into oil and gas, over 100 million years as those rocks get deeper. So that's where oil is created. But before the Shale Revolution, we didn't produce oil and gas out of the rocks it was created in. We waited, and Mother Nature, with just pressure, creates a whole bunch of millions, trillions of hydraulic fractures in the shale itself. And that's how the oil and gas seeps out of the shale and then floats upward and gets trapped in some other rock. So oil and gas production was about looking for places, hey, maybe the rocks bend here. We can see with this seismic technology, maybe the oil and gas got trapped there. And you drill down and, oh, we got oil, we're the Beverly Hillbillies, or no, we were wrong, it's water. So what the Shale Revolution is, instead of waiting for Mother Nature and searching, we just go into the rocks where oil is actually created, and we just speed up Mother Nature's process by delivering that pressure via water from the surface. And we create a whole bunch of fractures just like Mother Nature does. And we just speed up the process of the oil seeping out of the shale. We put it into our well bores and we bring it to surface.
That's a great explanation, and maybe the best I've ever heard, because, that idea of, well, we always had to find reservoir, the oil and gas industry had to find reservoirs. The sea change, the fundamental difference now with the Shale Revolution is you're not waiting on that process, that oil to be trapped. You're going directly to the source rock, which makes it, is that a fair assessment?
It is. There's no more dry holes. In the U.S. shale industry, there are 0 dry holes. You might drill a well and spend more money to produce the well and frack the well than you get out of oil and gas. So it's an economic loss. but every well drilled in the shale revolution produces oil and gas, because we're going to a place we already know the oil and gas is. Question is just, can we engineer it in a way that we can get out more dollars than we put in, so we have an economic process so the business can grow, and we try to engineer it to have the smallest possible impact on the nearby communities and the environment as large.
So let me talk about that then, because I want to back up. Well, actually, let me ask this question before, because I want to. You are have become one of the most public advocates in the oil and gas sector. One of the most vocal. You give speeches all the time about the importance of hydrocarbons. I watched a speech you gave last year about the link between health and hydrocarbons, and you point out that if my memory's right here, Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson together had 10 children, but only 2 of them lived to be adulthood and actually died of old age. And you use that as a way, you said, I think you said they didn't have uniquely bad luck. The reason that they live is that they lived in the age before hydrocarbons. I never thought of presidential history in those terms, but that mortality of children was much higher. People didn't live as long, and you're attributing this sea change in many of your presentations to the availability of oil and gas and coal.
Yeah, I think it's hard to overstate the transformation the arrival of fossil fuels did for the human condition. So yeah, as we were just talking there, you could just focus on the human health aspect. Life expectancy for humans, somewhere around 30 years throughout all of human history. Maybe it was 35 years in the middle of the 1800s. Then the arrival of fossil fuel. Global life expectancy today is over 70 years, a doubling of human life expectancy. More than 90% of the world lived on less than $2 a day throughout all of human history. Till the middle of the 1800s, we've had this transformation. Today, it's about 9% of the world. So I got to do that math. 89% of humanity lifted out of poverty, from oil and gas. That's the ultimate cost. That's the prime mover. Now, the specific things was it enabled modern medicine, it enabled public health, it enabled planes, trains, and automobiles, and all these things that were the immediate causes of it. But the enabler, why the world changed, was just the access to abundant energy that humanity had never had before. We were 100% renewable before. Almost all of our energy was from burning wood, agricultural waste, sticks, and dung. Solid biomass, that's what powered humanity until modern times. Robert, if I can say one other thing.
Sure.
Still a third of humanity get their primary energy, the cooking fuel and heating their homes, the same way our ancestors did, by burning wood, dung, or agricultural waste inside huts. So a third of humanity has not gone through this energy transition that doubled our life expectancy. And by World Health Organization data, about 3 million people a year die from that single cause of indoor air pollution from burning wood, dung, grass inside of huts. I've been to many of these huts myself through my travels. And I tell you, there's one thing they crave. They want lower cost energy, cleaner air, and they want to have the lives that we have. So to me, that my passion is to finish this energy transition to lift everyone else up.
It's interesting you bring up the indoor air pollution issue, because I didn't realize this until I was doing an interview the other day. Kirk Smith, who was the Cal Berkeley scientist who did that initial work on indoor air pollution and mortality numbers, died in June, and unexpectedly. But yeah, he was the pioneer in going to rural villages in developing countries and actually doing the field work. And then his work was adopted by the World Health Organization, that then extrapolated out those other numbers. So I completely agree. I completely agree with you. So one other question about this same thing. I watched a presentation you gave about 5 years ago before the House of Lords, and you talked about the same thing about the availability of energy. And you talked, in fact, about the doubling of horsepower, which I'd never really thought about, the move from using oxen to pull plows to using horses. I don't know how deeply you've researched that, but I thought that was a really interesting point. We think about draft horses all the time now, but they didn't always exist. How did you come on that fact? And can you tell me a little more about it?
Just research. I'm a history buff, so I always want to understand, the world used to be a certain way and now it's very different. When I was a kid, I wanted to understand, I had this life forming experience when I was about 12 years old. The only time I ever went to my dad's office in my life, I saw a homeless person on the street. And I thought, oh my God, why is there a person without a roof over his head, without enough food to eat? I knew nothing about mental illness um, or drug addiction. I didn't know anything about that. I just saw, oh my God, look how he lives and look how I live. That why is that not me? How is that? And then that opened this passion for understanding poverty. I've traveled around the world. I've been to 55 countries. My original question was, what causes poverty? And then what I learned, it took me many years, was I was totally asking the wrong question. Throughout all of human history, nearly everyone was poor. The question is, what lifts people out of poverty? And energy is a major part of that. My answer at the end was institutions, property rights, ownership, bottom-up organization, hence the name Liberty, culture, habits, belief in the future, and education. So everything my wife and I have done in our life is those sort of three things that lift people out of poverty, but all of them require energy to transform people's lives. Why literacy spread, cultural habits and large gatherings, the growth of human liberty, bottom-up organization, all of those enabled by fossil fuels and by energy. I always say the two things that created the modern world was this growth of human liberty, and maybe I think the most seminal event there is the Glorious Revolution in England, where the king had to give up power and we explicitly gave more bottom-up power. That idea obviously has a long genesis and that spread wider. But I always said human liberty is the primary driver and energy was the enabler that supercharged it in the middle of the 1800s. Although my son, a college student studying philosophy at Wesleyan, sent me a photograph of a book in the Wesleyan library called Foragers, Farmers, and Fossil Fuels. Ian Morris, he's a classics professor at Stanford. He gave these lectures at Princeton where you give a lecture, you lay out a thesis, people write challenges to it. And the book is outstanding. And he has a different view. I'm not sure how much he's right or I'm right or where the reality is, but his theory reverses the order in that. Foragers, meaning energy that powers human beings, the invention of agriculture. All of a sudden, much more abundant energy, but you need a different societal organization to harvest much more energy. Cities, the arrival of language, gathering. The world could access massively more energy through agriculture than they could through foraging. The sad part about that energy transition, it didn't increase human life expectancy. It didn't increase human health. It just meant we had more humans. So it did lead to language and cities and religion and all of our cultural things. It led to awesome things, but it didn't improve the lot in life of the average person. We got more of an upper class. It made society more stratified. But the energy transition that changed everything was the arrival of fossil fuels, because it was just massively more abundant energy and massively more abundant energy per person. So his theory is that it's the arrival of fossil fuels that enable the rise of human liberty. You know, his theory is we were able to end slavery. Women got the right to vote. We became a more egalitarian society and a wealthier society solely because of the arrival of a more abundant energy source. I've always said the arrival of human liberty made people free to engineer, to innovate, to do things differently, and humans are ingenious, so they develop fossil fuels. So I always give liberty primacy and fossil fuels as the supercharger. He makes an interesting argument that maybe it's really the reverse. It's the supercharging of energy that allowed this societal organizations to change. Definitely recommend the book.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because it's a point that I've made in the past, which was that it was electricity, the advent of electricity, widespread electricity in cities, that then allowed more people to move off of the farm, more women to get work in the cities, and then that led. I mean, it was a long process for women to get the right to vote, but I think that electrification was a key part of that, and the correlation to the time period of that electrification with the increasing rights of women to vote, particularly in states like Colorado, being among the first in the U.S. to grant that right was key. But one thing that just sparks sparks a quick reaction in me. In Joel Kotkin's new book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, he writes about this idea of liberty and the ability of society to throw off the kings and the priests, and that it really that started in Amsterdam in the 1600s, where it became a more open society that wasn't controlled by an elite few. Instead, there was a very much more of an egalitarian approach to to the running of society, and that's where I'd never heard that or never seen that historical comparison, but I thought it was a really interesting one.
No, I agree with Joel Cockens' argument that this sort of economic bottom-up organization, if we want to say where did that really roll in the modern world, it was in the Netherlands. That's where that began. There was a flourishing of that in Renaissance Italy, with trade and all that, that I think was also important, but it didn't really catch fire. It didn't continue on from there. It rolled backwards. But if you trace the ancestors of our bottom-up economic organization, absolutely, it's in the Netherlands, and I think there's a very interesting political and historical dynamics that may or may not have caused that.
Yeah.
But I always go a little bit one step further, because the actual start of and of course, economic power ultimately translated to political power. But so we have these. To me, the Glorious Revolution starts the top-down control politically, gives people a little more political bottom-up control. But I think we didn't really set people economically free in a large scale in any society until the 1800s.
Yeah.
There was a law called the Registration Act in the United Kingdom, and general incorporation laws in the U.S. 1839, starting in the U.S. We had a financial crisis. A lot of states couldn't pay their bonds. They had to do something to try to generate more money. And instead of taking state legislatures to grant you a limited liability, basically ability to form a corporation, it changed that you could just pay a fee and do it. In England, the Corn Laws are famous, but I think even more important was the Registration Act, where it no longer took a vote of parliament to give you a charter that gave you limited liability, which is very important to a business structure. It then became the Registration Act. You just had to follow the law and you could form things. Both of these right around 1840. I think we had political freedom. We still had slaves and women didn't have the right to vote, so we had a long way to go, but we were moving forward in political freedom. But the ideas of Adam Smith didn't really catch hold widely until the start of the 1840s. So to me, that's why I give the primacy to economic freedom. It really got rolling started to spread in the 1840s. First oil and gas well of meaningful commercial production wasn't until 1859. Oil industry's late 1800s. But coal's earlier than that, which is why Ian Morris's book, maybe coal maybe coal was the fuse that spread liberty that I talk about. I don't know which right, but I think it's hard to argue that the growth of bottom-up organization, human liberty, and abundant energy, those to me are the two central ingredients that changed the world, created the modern world, enabled the modern world.
So those are, I mean, I really like the way you're describing that. So how would you brushed around this, but let me ask you directly, because I asked this of a lot of people I interview. How would you define your politics?
Liberty, bottom up. I'm a bottom up organization guy. The world was top down throughout all of time. So in that setting, you don't get much innovation. You don't get, Amartya Sen, Indian economist, said, freedom is not only the most efficient way to create economic growth, it's an end in itself. To me, everybody has a different dream, a different wish. Authorship of our lives in my sort of anti-poverty programs, I think that's what people crave the most. People want to feel in control of their lives and author their future. So I guess the simplest way to say what I am is I'm a libertarian. I believe in government has a very important role to play, but when government starts putting barriers in people's way, and wealthy or educated people, they can work around any system, because we have a lot of those people today. But new immigrants arriving in this country, you put a minimum wage law in, you prevent them from getting jobs. I was 14 years old. We all worked our jobs. We have a $15 national minimum wage. Our kids aren't going to work. Most kids don't work today. We're inhibiting them getting skills. Low income immigrant workers, we're preventing them. Licensure laws. Immigrants from Haiti, they can't just braid people's hair. They do, but it's illegal. They can strap fines. If they're not a licensed beautician with 2 years of education, they're not allowed to do those jobs. So top-down big government, it's always justified in helping the people, but ultimately its dominant impact is to put barriers on their rising up. So I am a passionate free market libertarian. That's what created the modern world. That's the only thing that's ever lifted people out of poverty. And for the people still in poverty in our country, and the third of humanity in significant poverty around the world, that's the road for them to rise up. And I'm passionate about seeing that happen.
couple of quick thoughts in response to that. Well, I mean, this is one of the key themes in Matt Ridley's new book, Innovation and Why It Flourishes in Freedom, right? Matt, you know Matt well, and I'd like to call him a friend of mine as well. And I interviewed him on the podcast, and he made that point very clearly, that you need a system in which innovators can make their things happen, and that if you don't have that desire gets crushed. And so I've used Ridley now. I've mentioned him because I want to talk about Pinnacle Technologies, and in fact, you're mentioned in his new book. I misstated the title. It's How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. And I interviewed him on the Power Hungry podcast just a few weeks ago. And he cites your work with regard to the Shale Revolution at Pinnacle Technologies, a company you founded in 1992. I'm quoting from Matt's book. He said that Pinnacle was using tilt meter devices to help track the progress of fractures underground for Mitchell Energy in the Barnett Shale. Now, George Mitchell has been rightly recognized, and Mitchell Energy rightly recognized as one of the great entrepreneurs and innovators when it came to hydraulic fracturing. But you were there from the beginning. What did you bring to the table, and how early on were you involved with Mitchell in understanding how these fractures were working?
Yeah, I'd say it's a little bit of a blind squirrel finds nut story. Yes, I was not an oil and gas background guy.
You're the blind squirrel here.
I'm the blind squirrel. And there's a few of us that were blind squirrels. But we had for very different reasons, developed some technologies that allowed for the first time to measure how fluid moves 2 miles underground. So fractures are fluid moving and cracking rock. People don't know if they go north-south or east-west, or they parallel to the Earth's surface or perpendicular. So we developed some technologies so we could measure what actually happens down there. And one of the things we noticed was the fact that there are fractures mean if there's other fractures nearby, they interact, they change how each other grows. So, and that, it's sort of very techy, but it was like a different understanding. People thought if you pump fluid underground and you create a lot of fractures, they'll all coalesce into one frac, and therefore the contact area you can get with the rock is limited by how long and how tall a frac is. And if that's true, then shale would never work. The permeability is so low, the ability to flow through the rock is so low, you need millions of square feet of contact area, and heck, you can't even get to 100,000. So shale's not, we knew the oil's in shale for a long, long time, but it was thought like not possible to get it out. And so our measurements allowed us to see, actually there is a way, or there are conditions under which you can grow networks of fractures that might make shale work. I
he mentions here that the tilt meter device. I pride myself on my vocabulary. What's a tilt meter?
So a tilt meter is the carpenter's level to see if your floor or the shelf you put in is flat. It's the same thing, just with electronics on it. So we can measure very small tilts of the surface of the Earth, down to a part in a billion. The moon rotating around the Earth bends the crust of the Earth in a regular pattern every day by hundreds of parts in a billion. So we can measure these tiny flexures going on when you inject fluid deep underground. Those little movement of the rock down there causes very small movements of the ground at the surface. So by measuring those movements versus time, and then solving hey, the Earth is wrinkling this way, what must be causing that underground?
So
and then
your tilt meters were on the surface.
They're on the surface.
And measuring those micro fractures then several thousand feet below the ground.
Correct. And then we had subsequent technologies to run tilt meters down in well borers. We developed micro-seismic. So when you pump fluid underground, the rocks slip a little bit and you cause essentially micro earthquakes, but they're earthquakes about the equivalent of you pushed a half gallon of milk off your table and it hits the ground. That creates about a -3 or -4 magnitude earthquake. We measure those earthquakes underground. So a couple different technologies to measure what happens. And then the story, I was giving a talk in East Texas, I think in 1997, about these potential network fracs and how that might grow contact area. And a guy named Nick Steinsberger, incredibly important for the start of the Shale Revolution, he worked for Mitchell. Mitchell, God bless him, was a typical immigrant, hard-driving entrepreneur that wanted to figure this thing out. And Nick was the guy actually really trying these different frac techniques. And Nick was an innovative, very open-minded guy. The other guy, I think,
And he was
the
cited,
two,
and Ridley writes about him, and several people
yeah,
have written about Nick since then. But Pinnacle's role in this, until I read Ridley's book, I didn't really fully understand it. Go ahead, please.
and the other guy you've probably read about a fair amount is Mike Meyerhoffer. Mike Meyerhoffer worked at Union Pacific Resources, so the railroad company, owned a bunch of land and developed its own stuff. And Mike Meyerhoffer, PhD from Austria, he moved to the U.S., you know, a frack nerd like me, moved to the U.S., worked for Union Pacific Resources. He said, why don't we just pump water? We buy these fancy chemicals and we do all this stuff. Hey, we got to be cheap. We need big fracks. He started just these giant, because people did small water fracks in the old days. He started these giant water fracks in East Texas. And oh my God, the wells were cheaper and they produced more gas. So he didn't know why, but they worked. So Meyerhoffer's idea of these massive slick water fracks, I think technically, most important step in the shale revolution. Meyerhoffer meets Steinsberger at a baseball game in Dallas, and open-minded Steinsberger said, hey, I'll try it. And I met Nick around the same time saying, hey, fractures can grow differently. Maybe we can create networks. Refracts, you know, it was called refract reorientation. And so Nick drove this idea. Fortunately, he tried it 3 times because the first 2 in the Barnett Shale didn't yield a lot of gas, but he got approval to do 3. The third one went off, and it was the first sort of economic well in the Barnett Shale. And Nick's a determined guy. Mitchell's a risk taker. So they did more and more of them. Of course, I wanted to publish a paper on it. They said, no, you can't write about it. You can tell people that we're doing a lot of refracts in the Barnett, but we're not going to, is competitive advantage. We're not going to write about it. So years went on.
And so that was that the S.H. Griffin number 4? Was that in Dish, Texas? That was the well?
Correct. Yeah. Which we put in slides, and we say the frack that changed everything. So yeah, late 90s, vertical well. It's lucky in the Barnett Shale, you're able to get network fractures from vertical wells. Geologic pure luck. Almost anywhere else, you can't do that in a vertical well, but you could in the Barnett. So network fractures were understood. There was a bunch of refracts. Then of course, hey, what if we did the same thing, but we drilled horizontal and put a whole bunch of networks? So that introduced, and so that came later, around 2000 or 2001, is that maybe even early 2000s, is the horizontal fracks with these big network fracks that really, oh my God, these wells are phenomenal natural gas wells. And then, but that horizontal drilling plus these network slickwater fracks, that enabled it to work at all different rock types, whatever the stress state was.
And so in a very short time, the Barnett becomes one of the biggest gas fields in the world. I think it was number 9 at a certain point. But I want to read what Ridley wrote here. He said that pressurized water, to just follow on what you said, was creating cross-cutting fractures in the rocks, greatly increasing the surface area exposed to the sand. Fractures were propagating a mile or more in one direction, but spreading hundreds of meters either side of the axis too. And then this is what I wanted to come up with. In this case, science came in behind the technology rather than vice versa, which is kind of what you're saying, was that the process was going forward, but it wasn't fully understood exactly what was happening. It sounds like you had a theory, but you weren't sure.
Yeah, no, and it was just a theory that different fracks will do different things. It wasn't, hey, this theory might lead to commercial shale. No, it wasn't that. It was just, hey, you might be able to get network fractures underground. At that time, look, I'm an engineer. I didn't even know oil was in shale. I didn't even know at that time that oil and gas were the source rocks for shale. I just thought fracks grow differently. Nick and Mike had more understanding at that time. So exactly, I think Matt's so right in that. So many great things, they kind of come from trial and error and experimentation, and then they work, and that starts the chase for why do they work and how do we make them better.
So it was the confluence of the capital, which Mitchell was pumping a lot of money into this and not making any return on it, but willing to keep going. And then people meet at baseball games, they talk over beer, whatever, and then this, not by accident, by continued application of different technologies, the shale revolutions changed the world. I mean, fundamentally changed the balance of geopolitics. And I'll give you one quick fact, some analysis I just did just recently. The increase in oil and gas production in the United States since 2005, BP they're reporting in exajoules now, the increase alone is 34 exajoules. That's roughly equal to the entire energy consumption of India. I mean, It's just a massive, it's the biggest increase in energy production in world history. And there's no, the distant second. I don't even know what the distant second would be, but it's interesting to hear this history because I haven't, I keep learning about it. And the more I learn about it, it's just, it is a remarkable set of circumstances that allowed this to happen.
And Robert, the funny thing is at that time, so late 90s, early 2000s, as this technology leap is going on, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we can get gas out of the Barnett Shale. None of us had any idea how big it would be, that this would change the United States oil and natural gas balance, change geopolitics. We didn't think that at the time. We thought, wow, the Barnett Shale is unique and this thing really works. We did not appreciate the implications of this spreading for years later. Once we did appreciate it and it was happening, as you've seen, I don't know, for a dozen years or so, I've been talking about it. But I got a disclaimer. We had no idea at the beginning. We didn't think, this is going to change the world. We just thought, wow, this is funky.
And the science and the business came behind the technology. It was just, well, let's try this. And I mean, the legend was that Mitchell just said, well, damn it, why don't we just try water? But you're saying it was Mike Meyerhoffer that said that, but it doesn't really matter. The result was the same. So let me move on because there was one interesting point about Pinnacle, and you talked about this in one of your recent presentations. I think it was maybe 2 years ago that at Pinnacle you said, here it is, one of our early business contracts was CO2 sequestration, injecting it underground. Let's talk about carbon capture and sequestration because there's a lot of attention on that now. I have my own views on it. What's your view on that now as an opportunity to reduce CO2 emissions into the atmosphere? I guess what's your view? And second, can it scale? Because that to me is perhaps the biggest stumbling block.
So yeah, I mean, it's huge and enormous. It certainly can be done. Humans are ingenious and engineering can do that. But yeah, the magnitude of cost and pipeline and efforts to do it would be very large. Is it more likely to play a role in reducing CO2 emissions than building wind turbines around the world? Absolutely. But is it the most viable way and a practical way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Certainly not today. I mean, look, the biggest driver of reduced greenhouse gas emissions over the last 10 years, by far and away, is just natural gas displacing coal in the United States. And now natural gas hasn't displaced coal in the power stack globally yet, but it stopped the rise of coal. Coal production for electricity is plateauing. Natural gas is starting to take up some of that growth. So look, it's the same kind of thing. Humans are ingenious. Could it be engineered and done? Absolutely, it could. One of the harder issues there is extracting CO2 out of flue gas. So one of the things that's very intriguing to me on this lines is the alum process. Burning natural gas in supersaturated CO2 and oxygen only, and get the nitrogen out of the stream. Then you get a pressurized CO2 stream that could be sequestered underground, could be used for industrial purposes, could be used for oil production. But the total volume of CO2 across the spectrum is quite large. So it's a long-term thing. But those early projects where we were monitoring, they were just injecting CO2 into underground saltwater aquifers. And the question was, does it stay in there or is it going to leak back up to the surface of the earth? That's what got me very interested in climate change. So 15, 16 years, for me, it was a new business line for our company. So, hey, I'm all about new business. But my question was, is this going to be big? Is this going to be a future thing? And that led me to dive into understanding the science, the economics, what are the trade-offs here? And my view then, and similar today, 15 years later, is that the focus and money spent on greenhouse gas reduction today maybe is not the most efficient way to make the world a better place or to protect our environment. The world has been naturally decarbonizing since we went from wood to coal to natural gas to nuclear. I think that will continue, but immediate problems is particulate matter in the air. We talked about 3 million people from indoor air pollution, about 4 million people die from outdoor air pollution. These are big, current, and immediate problems. So to me, finishing the transition from biofuels, traditional fuels, to oil and gas is a massively bigger force to clean up the environment and expand human lives than the sort of whittling around the edges with greenhouse gas emissions. To date, the investments there have been gigantic. The benefits have been minute. And I think it's because we want to plow a bunch of money into today's technologies that really aren't viable for long-run energy transitions, instead of spending that money on research and technologies that probably will be the future of energy. We don't know who those are yet. But I mean, I went to college to work on fusion energy. I worked in graduate school. I worked in solar energy. I worked in geothermal energy afterwards. I was late to the oil and gas game. I don't care where energy comes from. It's just got to be plentiful, cost effective, and abundant and clean to make people's lives better. And clearly, to me, wind and solar are never going to be dominant sources of energy in the world. They just take too much land, too much materials, and they have that intermittency problem. And those are not challenges we're likely to engineer around. We need dispatchable, meaning ready when we need them, energy dense technologies. So I'm a huge fan of nuclear, both fission and fusion that I went to college to work on that'll arrive someday. Humans will solve the energy challenge for sure. It's essential to life. But I think our focus right there these days is actually slowing progress, not speeding it.
Well, so let me ask you about then that, because you talked about wind and solar, and I've written a lot about it, thought a lot about it. Why are those, well, two related questions. Why is the oil and gas industry, and particularly hydraulic fracturing, demonized so much? And why are wind and solar so politically favored? The latest Gallup numbers, I think 70% of people want more wind, 80% want more solar. Why are they winning the popularity contest?
Well, because we're terrible salesmen. Terrible. You know, if you're focusing on business and doing stuff.
Who's we? Who are you talking about?
Well, the oil and gas industry.
Okay.
You know, look, we focus on our business. We're not in the game of gathering subsidies. There are subsidies in oil and gas. I don't like them. I wish we had no subsidies in energy. I'm a libertarian. I don't want subsidies. I want everyone competing to bring out technologies that move us forward, not gather rents or special monies. But wind and solar, because of the intermittency problem and because of the giant amount of steel cement and land it takes to produce power, they don't have much hopes of being commercial on their own. And they've been very effective at garnering a huge amount of money. The net effect of that has been to increase electricity prices, not meaningfully lower CO2 emissions. But that story sells. It's romantic. The sun is there, the wind is there. You know, this dream to go to 100% renewable. Well, we were 100% renewable throughout all of human history, and life was miserable. Then we descended from about 100% renewable. Maybe we bottomed out at about 12 or 13% in the 1970s, and maybe we're up to like 15% now. We've added an incredibly small amount of net new energy just because they're technologies that I think won't scale, but they're politically popular. It's a good story. People buy into it, and people believe they're cheaper. Oh, they're cheaper.
So I think you're right about the romantic part of it, but let me, in my lifetime, I can't remember a time when the oil and gas sector was more out of favor than it is now. Exxon was recently removed. Was it from the S&P or from the Dow Jones?
Dow Jones.
Nobody wants to own oil and gas stocks. Very unpopular. ESG is a big issue in Europe. But BlackRock has said they're not going to invest in coal plants. European Development Bank says no more hydrocarbons. BP, British Petroleum, is saying they're going to reduce the amount of oil they produce. This is I guess a business question and a personal one. And you've given a passionate defense of hydrocarbons, but how much are you backfooted on this? I mean, and how much of this is a passing, I'm not going to say a fad, how much of this will pass and how much is this going to endure, because the industry as a whole, both financially and politically, faces a lot of headwinds.
We do indeed. All of what you say is true. But I'm not backing away. I'm leaning in on this issue. I want to engage on this issue. Environmental as well. Look, I'm an outdoor guy. My wife and I were mountain climbers. We travel the world. I'm on the board member of an environmental group. I am passionate about wealthy societies protecting environment or whatever. So it's not like I disagree on the ends. It's just how to get to those ends. And I want to change the messaging. There's no other thing we talk about. What are the negatives without what are the positives? Does oil and gas production have impacts on the environment? Of course. We use land, we drive trucks, we emit pollutants, we've emitted greenhouse gases. We've almost 50% increased the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, but nothing comes for free. So to me, it's the trade-offs. You put out a wind farm, you impact a giant amount of land, you use an enormous amount of oil and gas to build a wind farm. The blades are made out of oil. There's 100 tons of coal in every tower of every wind turbine inside the steel. That's what steel is, iron plus carbon. That comes from coal to go into the steel. 100 tons more to get that coal into the turbine. So the term renewable or clean energy is also just, it's just awesome marketing. A million years from now, way over 90% of the oil and natural gas underground will still be there. So it's believed like a finite resource, we're soon to run out. None of that is even remotely true. It's just the reserves of oil and gas underground right now are the greatest they've ever been known. And as we continue to consume more, the amount we know that we can produce economically keeps growing. And the part we can produce economically is still a tiny subset of the actual oil and gas underground. So the belief that it's a finite resource is wrong. The belief that, wind and solar, somehow you put them up and you have energy for free, of course, is totally wrong. They have short lifetimes. It takes new steel, new metals, new materials, new stuff to build them. And look, if wind and solar win economically, I worked in solar power. I like solar better than wind because I think it has some prospects to play a meaningful role in world energy generation. Wind, I think, unlikely, without subsidies, it unlikely ever plays a meaningful role in world energy generation. But yeah,
solar has 10 times the power density. That's the where I come down. It's just, factor of 10, that's a big number, especially when it comes back to the land use issues and the other inputs that you're talking about. But let me interrupt and just because I don't want to keep you, too much longer, but you mentioned that idea, which I think is really key, that the shale revolution has fundamentally changed the fortunes of the oil and gas industry, and that it's as Daniel Yergin told me, it was you told me, well, there are no more dry holes. But is that a problem though for the industry in that it faces this potential of continual oversupply, right? Because no, there's not a shortage, but you have to be so good. It's a manufacturing game now, I guess. If the supply is infinite, how do you maintain the control of the supply so the price doesn't go to zero as it has in some locations recently?
So great question. And this is a thing, I got two hats on. I want the world, people to have better lives, longer lives, richer lives. I celebrate that fact. It has been awesome for consumers. Huge disruptive innovations cause massive wins for consumers, and businesses have to fight hard to see if there's going to be winners there. There's always going to be more losers than winners. And the last decade for shale has been transformative for the world. Over $1 trillion saving to the consumers every year through lower oil and natural gas prices, not just in the US, but globally. For low-income people, moderate-income people, this is phenomenal. But I liken it to the dot-com boom. All of the new, so when I lived in San Francisco, 7th and Townsend, literally the ground zero for the dot-com boom. And in the 90s, incredible amount of money went in. The internet is awesome. It's going to change the world. They were right about that. But everybody wanted to invest, lend money, venture capital, start a company. I had friends that quit and started wines.com and pets.com, and I should have a .com and raise money. So just giant amount of money. Then it busted, right? There's not going to be 500 great profitable internet companies. So a lot of money excited about something transformative came in, over investment, terrible returns, a huge crash. Now there's much less. The internet is more concentrated, but there's, Google's not going away.
And you're saying all this, and I'm thinking, well, he's talking about the oil and gas industry in the last 5 years. Haynes and Boone, what was it? They're showing the number of bankruptcies in the oil and gas sector. Deloitte just estimated $300 billion in net negative cash flow in the oil and gas sector since 2010. I mean, these are massive losses. And you've seen, your own company you've had some real serious struggles. So how do you make money? How do you stay afloat?
We get through the dot-com bust. We're in the dot-com bust right now. The shale revolution was, as he said, awesome for consumers, terrible for business. If you invested money in oil and gas the last 10 years, the returns are horrible. Giant amount of destroyed capital. I will say, we started Liberty 9.5 years ago. Our average cash return on cash invested since the day we started the company to today, 27%. The S&P 500 is like 19%. So we've actually had good returns, even in a terrible market environment, averaged over that time period. But I think the next decade, we're going to have less companies, less investment in oil and gas, smaller employment in oil and gas, which all sound negative, but that's progress. That's efficiency. U.S. is going to produce more energy with less people at lower cost. Is that tough for businesses? Of course. But that's what bottom-up organization is about. Everyone's trying to outdo the other person and move forward. The ultimate winners in capitalism is consumers. Businesses have to fight and innovate or get better, or they go out of business. I do think, Robert, the next decade will be better for our industry than the last decade, which is a low bar. But we're seeing a lot of companies go out of business. We're seeing companies merge. Look, the Shale Revolution in American oil and gas production is essential to balance oil and gas supply and demand worldwide over the next 20 years. But is the average oil price going to be, and gas price, be significantly lower than it would have been without the Shale Revolution? Absolutely. So it's creative destruction. That's the beauty of capitalism.
Well, so let's talk about Liberty, because and this is kind of a business question, kind of a personal question as well, I suppose. But I mean, you've had some terrible financial results in the last few months. In July, you reported a net loss, $45 million for the second quarter. Same quarter last year, you made $65 million. So you got a delta of $110 million. That's a massive swing in fortunes. As I recall, you had to lay people off. Is that right? Which I'm sure is painful. How do you just, well, I guess the question is, how do you keep your equilibrium, right? I mean, where you've been, you've gone from 0 to 100 miles an hour, and now you're in the school zone, and you're getting slowed down dramatically. How do you manage that on just kind of on a personal basis?
Yeah, all that is true. It is a very cyclical business. And the reason it is, I think of Denver when I grew up. They built a whole bunch of office buildings. Denver was a boom town. Then the sin fuel things collapsed, oil prices collapsed, and like they didn't build an office building in Denver for 15 years. So imagine if your business was,
and there was a lot of empty office space for a long time. Yeah.
So imagine being in the business of building office buildings. It was crazy, and then it went to near zero. If you build an asset that lasts a long time, office buildings last a long time, oil and gas wells last a long time, you get a cyclical industry. It only takes a small change in supply or demand to slow down the building of these new long-lived assets. And so this is the nature of our business. It's always going to be that way. So we have to design and prepare our business for that. But COVID was, of course, quite extreme, right? We have frac industry is like a $25 billion a year industry. The frac services part that Liberty is in, demand for that dropped 85% in 60 days. Think of a giant industry, like a 5% hit to demand's tough. Now it's been bouncing back since then, but those huge swings cause pain. I've never laid anyone off in my 28 years running oil and gas companies. So April was very tough. I had a brutal week where we did lay off people. We are hiring those people back right now, not all of them, but I think we will in the next 12 months, but very tough. And so going into this, I've just got to believe, I love this industry. I believe it's important. I know it's going to be cyclical, and you got to design a business that can survive rapid up and downs. It is not for everyone, but to me, I know of no industry more important for people's lives and for enabling our future. And I want to be in it in spite of having to ride a roller coaster.
Well, so let me ask you one question about the Schlumberger deal, because I just want to make sure I got this right. So it was kind of unusual that there was no cash involved. Correct me if I'm wrong, they gave you a bunch of equipment and personnel, and I'm assuming buildings and some other equipment and so on. And they got a 37% equity stake in your company. Is that the right analysis?
That's exactly right. Because we're in this downturn right now. We've had people laid off. Everyone in our business is on reduced salary, and we've had to pull back our 401k match. So we've all tightened our belts to get through that. That was one of my biggest worries. People are going to say, my God, I'm on reduced salary. I'm scared to death. And we had enough money to buy a big company. And that is a reaction people had. But that's, as you just said, Robert, that's why we did it this way. No dollar is going to change hands. We're just issuing more stock. So we're splitting the ownership among our company with some new owners. And so a lot of equipment, a lot of facilities. I'm in one of these new facilities right now that we don't own yet, but we will around January 1. But a huge part of this deal, the huge driver, as you and I just talked, the Shale Revolution is a product of technology, incredibly important innovation. Liberty, our company, has a little bit more than 50 patents and I'm not a huge actually patent fan. I love technology, but that's a marker for technology. We're buying 60 years of technology development and a patent portfolio of 400 patents. We're buying technologies that, coupled together with ours, will bring a next generation of electric frac fleets, lower emission technologies, more efficient operations, better big data analytics to figure out how to get more oil and gas with less shale wells or cheaper shale wells, smaller footprints. So maybe the biggest driver of this was technology. We're combining really the leaders in shale technology into one entity.
And so when the merger is finished, then you'll be the third largest hydraulic fracturing operation or hydraulic fracturing company in the country. Then is that right?
Actually, we'll be second.
Okay.
If you take all the oilfield service companies, drilling, all of the oilfield service companies will be third. In North American revenues, North American, so not global, Halliburton will be number one, Schlumberger number two, Liberty number three, Baker Hughes, a longtime institution, number four, National Oilwell Varco number five. Those are not frac companies.
Yeah.
So of
right.
all companies providing services to oil and gas development. So for a 9.5 years old company, oh my God, our growth has been fast and exciting and never boring.
You'll be the second largest among the frackers then, behind Halliburton.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So the only financial side of this is you're issuing stock to make the transaction happen then. So it's some dilution of existing shareholders. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's what it
right.
is. But we hold on to our cash and our ability to ride through this and to reinvest as we come out of it.
Okay. Got it. Well, that's a great summary. I'm glad to get that because I've looked at the reporting on that and I thought it's an unusual deal where no cash is changing hands, but one that is interesting because it sounds like it's really all about scale and making sure that you have the scale in order to compete in this market and an electric frac. So let me explain it, give you my understanding of it and tell me if I'm right. So instead of using the big diesel fired V8 and V12, V16 engines that you have truck mounted now, you're going to use an electric generator and then run electric pumps instead of big diesel fueled pumps. Is that right? That's some of the technology you're getting from Schlumberger?
Well, actually to run the pumps electrically, that's been an internal Liberty development effort for the last 2 years. So no, the electric pump technology, that's coming from Liberty. But there's other equipment on location that has to mix the water, has to blend in the sand. We call it the backside. It's like lower pressure stuff, but it's a little bit more complicated. Schlumberger has fully electric backside with these automated process controls that operates all on itself. So we're marrying their half of the frac fleet that's electric with the other half, the higher horsepower half that we've been developing. But those two together, I think will make a meaningfully better frac fleet than exists today. And, that's still a year to 2 years away. But yeah, this accelerates that effort.
And it's lower emissions and less noise on site. And that's one of the savings in fuel costs. Those are the big advantages.
You got them all. You got them all.
Well, there you go. See, I am paying attention sometimes.
Absolutely.
Okay. So just two last things, Chris, and I appreciate your time. By the way, this is again, the Power Hungry Podcast. We're talking with Chris Wright, the chairman and CEO of Liberty Oilfield Services. So a couple of things that I like to ask all my guests, in addition to having them introduce themselves. So what are you reading? You read a lot. You said you're a history buff. What books are on your stand right now? What's igniting your interest these days?
So I read a lot about what created the modern world, a lot about history. My son's a philosophy major, so I read with him. But let me mention a few books that came out this year that I think are very important. Matt Ridley, who we talked about, is a friend of mine, and Matt's a friend of mine because I've been reading his books and I've loved his thought. We think similarly, so it's been great to know Matt. But Matt's new book that you mentioned is simply outstanding.
How innovation works.
Bjorn Lomborg's book, False Alarm, fantastic. It's really making a readable version of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC reports. What do these reports actually say? He doesn't talk that much about the science. He just accepts, okay, the predictions are, he takes worst case of how much warming. What does that mean to the world? What are the trade-offs about addressing it head on or adapting to it and investing otherwise? So it's sort of an overview of a very big and important issue. Michael Schellenberger's book,
Apocalypse Never.
Apocalypse Never. I love that play on Apocalypse Now, the movie. But is a career environmentalist saying, as his thinking has evolved as he's been mugged by data and numbers and all that. And he's always been a very thoughtful guy. And my interviewer right now, Robert Bryce, has a new book, and it was a movie last year as well. That's incredibly important. And it's about electricity and how that's impacted human life, how societies have evolved as electricity arrived, how societies that don't have electricity would evolve and should evolve as they get electricity. This is that nexus between human quality of life and electricity, energy in the broader perspective. So I encourage everyone, if you can learn a little bit more, and you got to read interest, Vaclav Smil, I think, is maybe the phenomenal guy in energy, but you got to be a tech nerd like me and patient, but he writes awesome stuff. It's deep, it's in depth. He's got no agenda. I think Robert and Matt Ridley and Lomborg, to some extent, just make it much more accessible to people to read about energy and really the nexus between environment, energy, quality of life, climate change. Those are all hot issues today, and a lot of people are very passionate about them, but don't go that X step to dig in a little bit deeper to understand them. Look, politicians, of all stripes, they have no interest to give a reasonable perspective on something. That's not a good source of information. Activists as well, they have a belief, they have an agenda, they're important in our society, but they're not realistic sources of information. So I encourage everyone. I just laid out 4 great books there all this year, so they're all up to date. Any of those books will give you a better view into these trade-offs among energy systems. Robert's got a podcast now, as you obviously know, but I think to society—
I had this guy Chris Wright on. He's really good. And he talks about my stuff. It's amazing. And I didn't even give you any money for it.
as people understand energy and people's need for energy and human history and all that, it's just so important in society. So it's a subject of a lot of passion and a lot of opinions and views, but not much education. And I don't blame people. It's not taught in schools. Again,
sure.
But I don't know. I'm all for energy education. There's great stuff out there. Dive into it. It'll make you excited and knowledgeable.
So this last question, maybe it's redundant to what you just talked about, but I'll throw it out there anyway, because it's what I like to end on. So what gives you hope? I mean, we're the last few months have been challenging, right? With the pandemic, there's a lot of political unrest. There's, marching in the street. There's a lot of racial strife. It's, frankly, I'm not going to say I've been depressed, but it's been hard to be optimistic sometimes. What makes you hopeful for the future?
What makes me hopeful for the future is the dynamism of societies that are free. And look, there's fights. Rich countries tend to have a pendulum swinging against freedom. People want more control, top-down views. These people are too stupid. We got to decide decisions for them. So we have a bit of a pendulum swinging that way in the rich countries. But in the lower income or middle income countries, the pendulum's dominantly swinging the other way. Africa has been a passion of mine my whole life. I was in school in the 80s, and boy, from 1980 to the mid 90s, Africa did not make any progress. It was terrible. It had corrupt top-down rulers. They were entrenched. We didn't get out of there. Now we have a number of countries where property rights and freedom are going on, and they're dynamic societies. Kenya is taken off. Malawi is moving forward. Namibia actually was and Botswana, early movers in some freedom, some growth, some dynamism in African countries. India, obviously, Robert, as you've covered in your book and your movie, is going forward. So humans are ingenious. If they're set free, they make progress. And freedom is still very large today in historical perspectives. There are forces against that. I do worry about those, but human freedom will win in the end, and it's made enormous progress the last 2 decades. I'm confident it will. And as it does, as Matt wrote, you get innovation, you get solutions. We'll have a vaccine for COVID massively faster than ever would have been in human history. That's technology, that's human freedom, that's dynamism. The world is less racist, less sexist. All the problems we have today, which are real, are better than they ever were before. And we're all passionate about making them even better yet in the future. But if you look at the broad sweep of history, the media loves to sell a decline narrative. It's actually not true. The society's had enormous steps progress. Hans Rosling's Factfulness, another short, very readable book. It's just data. He's a socialist public health doctor in Sweden. I love him. He's awesome. Yeah. But he writes about what's actually happened in the world over the last 200 years. It is an uplifting story. So read what's actually happening. You'll be uplifted. Not the scary stuff that only focuses on the negatives. The positives are much larger, and I'm highly confident they will be in the decades to come.
Well, that's great. That was a mouthful. You talk faster than I do.
I gotta get shorter answers someday.
Well, Chris, this has been great. I really appreciate your time. It's been wonderful. We had a call to action. I asked Chris before we started recording, what's the call to action? And his answer, well, he just gave it to you, was read more, learn more about this, and that's critical. And I completely agree with you. So Chris Wright, CEO and chairman of Liberty Oilfield Services, thanks a million for being on the Power Hungry podcast. To all you people out there in podcast land, if you like this one, tune in next time. You can go to ratethispodcast.com/powerhungry and give us 14, 25, 64 stars on there, whatever they allow you. But again, thank you for tuning in to this edition. Tune in again for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks so much, Robert. My pleasure. Take care.